via a landing and die as well. So look, these farm scale natural capital accounts do pave the way to reward farmers for any nature positive actions that they're doing on their farm, and give the opportunity to share the cost burden above, of course, the production benefits that we know are usually an outcome of environmental management on properties and of maintaining or improving natural ecosystems. So it's a big and new thing for a lot of primary producers at the moment, not the environment, but the markets associated with and the metrics to prove which direction they're going with their farm management as far as the environment's concerned. So I'm going to wrap up because I'm not the expert on this, and I'm already thinking Danny and Jim and Ange might be thinking, why is Angela saying that? So look, we're really happy to be working with these guys. They're a great team, and what they've been working on with this process has just been really amazing. So I will hand over to Jim and Ange and Danny to present to everyone here today. And thank you so much for getting on. And please, any questions directly to Landcare Farming, just get back to us at Landcare, whether they relate to this, what we're talking about today, or any other thing that's happening. Thank you for getting on. And I will mute myself and hand over to you, Jim, Danny and Ange. And when I disappear, don't think I'm not wanting to, it's just I have to. So thank you.
No worries. Thanks very much, Ange. And welcome everybody. And it's great to see so many people joining live. Numbers are clicking over there, over heading up towards 60. So I'm really, really thrilled about that that involvement and that interest. And thanks very much, Ange, and the whole Landcare team for giving us the opportunity to talk to you today about our project, about farm scale natural capital accounts. I'm from, my name's Jim Radford. I'm an associate professor in landscape ecology and conservation biology at La Trobe Uni, and I lead the project, and I'll let Danny and Ange introduce themselves as they get into their sessions. Just before many of you came on, we're talking about where we're speaking from today, where we're coming to you from today. So before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Central Victoria, Judge Run country, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge their custodianship of the country on which I live and work predominantly many millennia. I'm just going to share my screen now. So just hopefully somebody give me the heads up that you can see my screen.
Yep, all there, Jim.
Okay. Can't see where the hell they're going. Beg your pardon. There we go. Okay, cool. So we're going to be talking to you in quite a different scales about farm scale natural capital accounting. And before we start, I just acknowledge that this project has been funded through the Australian government's Landcare program, through the Smart Farming Partnership project or scheme. You can see it's a collaborative project. We have 10 or 11 organisations involved in the project down here, and I've got Danny from Integrated Futures and Ange from Bush Heritage joining on this presentation today. But we have a number of other key partners that are involved as well, and their logos are down the bottom there. So it's very much a collaborative joint effort to get to where we are. We started this project back in 2020, and we're in the final well, we've sort of entered the stadium, I think, if we think about a marathon, or maybe the stadium's in sight. So we're due to finish at the end of this year. So we're in the last 4 or 5 months of the project, and it's been a long haul through COVID and all the challenges that threw up as well. So we're pretty proud of what we've been able to achieve to date. And we hope to share that with you, or we will be sharing that with you today. So this is what we're going to go through. A very brief introduction to what is natural capital, because I think most people on this call probably have a fairly good understanding of that already, but perhaps less so why we need natural capital accounting. And then we'll go through how we've compiled the natural capital accounts in this project, and you'll see that they're quite detailed. Some of you might have been involved in the natural capital project run by Landcare, and this is, if you like, the next step further in terms of the complexity and the detail that we put into the reports. Then Danny will lead you through an example of the farm scale NCA accounts that we've developed to date, and then I'll throw back to me, and I'll go through some of the biodiversity and ecosystem services values that we're adding to the accounts for a bit of an extra depth. And then Ange will lead us through the so what question. So what are some of the benefits of farm scale natural capital accounting. Now, we'll stop after each of these sessions and pause for questions or comments at each point, and then there'll be time at the end as well for more general discussion. However, if anybody has any questions, please just pop them in the Q&A or the chat there, and those that or Danny or myself is not talking that time, we'll try to answer those in the chat. So that's the agenda for today. Okay, so what is natural capital and natural capital accounting? Well, here's the stock standard definition of natural capital. The stock of all renewable and non-renewable natural resources, plants, animals, soils, water, air, and minerals. So notice that there's living things as well as abiotic or non-living things as part of that stock of natural capital that combine in various ways and often with other inputs from humans, and that combination of those resources yield a flow of benefits to people. And we'll talk about some of the varied type and quantity of those flows. So in an agricultural context, and that's our focus today, obviously, natural capital includes both naturally occurring ecosystems, things like, I'll just get my pointer here. Things like grassy woodlands and native grasslands and native forests, and shrublands and those sorts of things in both their, largely undisturbed or natural state, but also they may be used to some extent for production purposes such as grazing or agroforestry, and so in their disturbed state as well. But we also include ecosystems that have been established and maintained by humans, and that may be comprised either partly or entirely of non-native plant species. So this might be shelter belts, or those things that are the actual, products or the focus of agricultural production. So crops and pastures as well is included in the broader definition of natural capital in a farming sense, in an agricultural system. So natural capital does not equate directly to nativeness or naturalness per se, but rather to the range of ecosystem assets that are present in an agricultural landscape. And that may be woodland, wetland, cropland, pasture lands, those sorts of things, shelter belts. But the key point is that they have a defined spatial extent, and with a related set of attributes that we can identify and measure, and so that we can put characteristics around them that define their capacity to provide a range of ecosystem services. So this is some of them in this diagram here, as I've mentioned. Shelter belts and particularly areas associated with creek lines and riparian areas are particularly important. We've got the soil, the underlying foundation, and the water resources that are associated with that, both surface water and groundwater, and aquifers. So the native fauna that provide a range of services, as well as the natural capital that's part of the production system, the crops, the pastures, the livestock, and so forth. So we have those natural capital assets that we might consider the stock of natural capital on a farm that, as I said, combine to yield a range of ecosystem services. That might be provisioning services such as the crops or the wool or the meat that's taken off the farm as the farm product, or it might be regulating services such as providing microclimate benefits or pollination or pest control services. But they combine to provide some sort of value, some sort of benefit to society. And so again, in an agricultural sense, we can think about these in terms of who is receiving the benefit of those ecosystem services and where they sit in the production system. So, as I said, we can have regulatory services provided, such as shade and stock for shelter, which improve the efficiency of the production on the farm. They can provide habitat for beneficial insects that might be providing the decomposition or pollination or pest control or nutrient cycling services that underpin the agricultural production on the farm. They can provide some benefits to society, such as storing and sequestering carbon, and so having a macroclimate affected influence there. At a catchment scale, vegetation, be that trees, shrubs, or even grasses and low shrubs for filtering flows into waterways, protect waterways from runoff from the wider landscape, and so improve water quality and reduce soil erosion in our river systems and catchments. At a broader scale, a lot of the natural capital on a farm is important as habitat for biodiversity and provides places in which our native species are able to persist. And then there's the benefits for the farm production itself. So obviously natural capital provides forage for livestock, which is then converted into food and fibre. It provides the foundation, the soil, and the nutrients and the minerals in which crops and horticulture grow, and the water resources that are involved in growing those crops and produce. And there's a whole range of soil functioning and soil biology processes that go on that enable that to happen. We do acknowledge that there are some disservices or disbenefits, if you like, that might be associated with some elements of this natural capital. For example, some remnants of native vegetation, whilst they provide benefits, they also may be habitat for pests, or there may also be a competition zone close to some of these areas in which pasture growth is competing with trees or shrubs for light, for nutrients, for water, and so there's a reduced production area that's quite close to that shelter belt or that remnant. And so there's a competition zone that diminishes production quite close to it. And so one of the things that we're interested in our accounting is trying to quantify those benefits and to see how far the benefits, the reduced wind effect or the shade or the shelter or the benefits of beneficial insects, how far into the production system that extends, and does that outweigh some of those competitive effects that happen in that competition zone. So as a quick run through Natural Capital 101. Now, natural capital accounting, like financial accounting, that most of us are fairly familiar with, is based on a standardized set of concepts and methods that are coherent with the UN endorsed system of environmental economic accounting. And what we're doing in natural capital accounting is simply quantifying that natural capital asset base and then estimating the contribution they make through that provision of ecosystem services to the economy and society. So that might be to the farmer or the enterprise, at the farm enterprise scale, as well as to society more broadly through those public benefits that we mentioned, like habitat for biodiversity, carbon sequestration, catchment health, water quality, those sorts of broader societal benefits. Now, we're preparing our accounts in physical terms. So what is the biophysical extent and condition of the natural capital assets on a farm? And where we can, we are looking at the monetary value that those biophysical assets provide to the farmer as well as to society, so that we can recognise, that there's important information about the physical condition of the properties that can be translated into monetary terms, but more importantly, they enable those that are making the decisions about how that land and those resources are managed to pull levers that can try and maximise the natural capital on a farm and maximise the value of the services that they're producing. In this project, our farm-scale natural capital accounts are accounts prepared specifically and unapologetically at the farm scale or the enterprise scale. So it's worth noting that most attempts or most of the sort of economic environmental accounting that does occur, ecosystem accounts and the like, happens at much larger scales than individual enterprises. It's usually at a national scale or a regional scale, where the estimates are of the extent of an ecosystem that's present in the landscape, or the amount of native vegetation that's retained, at very large scales or at national scales. And that there's actually relatively few examples of these accounts being prepared at farm scale. And I'd say we're right at the forefront of developing those. Come back, Danny. So why do we need to generate natural capital accounts? Can't we just know the benefits be aware of the benefits that the natural assets provide to the production system and be happy with that? Well, we can accept that that's A, failing in many instances, and B, it's not rewarding those producers who are managing their farm in a productive but sustainable way. So in a traditional accounting, financial accounting sense, the focus is entirely on a very limited set of farm assets. So it might be considered these agricultural assets that are recognised in traditional financial accounting. So assets such as the infrastructure on a farm, the fences and the machinery that's involved, the land value itself, as well as the products that are taken off the farm. So the crops, the livestock when it's sold at market, any forage or silage that's sold, those sorts of things. So if we were to think about the whole farm ecosystem that we're looking at previously, what's in colour here is what's recognised in financial accounts. And so all of these ecological assets that we see in this middle frame here are invisible in traditional accounting terms. So all of that underlying natural capital, the soil, the water, the pastures, the native vegetation, the wildlife that's helping to support the production on a farm is invisible. And so that doesn't enable any assessment of how much a particular farming enterprise is drawing down on that natural capital, using it up without replenishing it, or alternatively, how much a production system is building and benefiting from that natural capital, but doing so in such a way that it's either maintaining or enhancing these ecological assets on a farm. And for a complete picture of the farm's assets, we need to include not just these ecological assets, but also the biological assets on a farm. So there we throw in things like the livestock that's involved in a farming system. And it involves a fuller picture or a complete picture of the interaction between the ecological natural capital assets and the biological assets, the livestock, the crops, everything that's taken off the farm from a production sense. And so what this does is it really integrates natural capital as an essential part of the farming system, an essential part of the economy, and recognises that natural capital is fundamental to how we value and manage a farm. And as Angela was saying at the start there, it can, we can use this to, if we can account for it and demonstrate change in it, evidence of nature positive actions and operations that are both positive for nature and positive for production. Okay, so just to summarise, our farm-scale natural capital accounts are standardised, verifiable and repeatable methods to measure the stocks and flows in natural capital over time. We, as you'll see, are using a whole range of different metrics to measure different aspects of the environmental performance for the farm as a whole. And this includes measures of ecosystem health, of soil condition, of greenhouse gas sequestration and emissions, of the resource use intensity, so the net export and use of nutrients and pollutants in the production of farm products, and an assessment of their impact or their benefits for biodiversity at farm scale. This doesn't replace other sort of systems, but in fact, we think it complements financial accounting to provide an expanded view of what we might mean by farm profits and farm operations. And it broadens our understanding of farm performance by considering impacts of natural capital and the services that they provide, that's ecosystem function in effect, so that we can think about this two ways. How farm performance is affecting natural capital and ecosystem services and ecosystems, but conversely, how those ecosystems and the natural capital on a farm are contributing to the farm business, to the productivity and the profitability and the financial performance of the farm business. So I'll just pause there for any questions that there might be around, well, didn't mean to do that. Any questions that there might be around those concepts so far around natural capital accounting. Just check the chat.
There was one question in the chat about is the food and fibre production considered a benefit to society from ecosystem services? And I think that's slide 6 that you referenced there.
Well, the offtake from the farm in the accounting sense is considered a private benefit. So the food and fibre is benefits the farmer. That's their livelihood. So in that sense, that food and fibre offtake is a private benefit. But obviously, at a broader sense, in terms of the provisioning services that nature provides, then yes, we need to feed and clothe the world, and that is done off the back of natural capital and the underlying ecosystems that form part of a farm. So in an accounting sense, that's considered sort of a private benefit, but at a broader conceptual sense, I think certainly it's considered one of the provisioning ecosystem services.
And that is also included in the traditional accounting processes. That's one of the things that is included in traditional accounting processes.
There's a question there from Peter. Yes, the systems are coherent with the UN's system for environmental economic accounting, which is a global sort of framework that the EU has signed up to, and various other organisations in the US. So the basics of it, which is assets, identifying the condition and extent of natural capital assets on a farm, identifying and quantifying the ecosystem services that flow from those assets, and then the value of those. That's the basis of the SEA framework. I think we're extending it, to be perfectly honest, about adding detail and granularity, as you'll see, that enables us to do that at a farm scale. But we are following the framework that is coherent with the UN SEA methodology.
And Nikki's got her hand up.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Jim. I was wanting to find out, you've got different timeframes. So if you're looking at a farm, you've got certain, well, as you were talking about there's a food and fibre that might be regularly taken off the property, and livestock that comes in and out. How does the accounting, I presume you might get to that still, so stop me if you are. Okay, you will. Okay, I was just kind of wondering, are you thinking about, is this annual accounting? Is it quarterly?
Yep. Yeah. So certainly not quarterly. Danny will cover this a little bit. Different elements when we work through them. Different elements are updatable at different scales. So some elements around the production side of it, and the resource use intensity and the emissions and that sort of thing. That information is drawn from what should be standard farm business sort of operational data that is updated annually. The ecosystem assessment that I'll jump into in a minute, we would not recommend that that's needed every year, because we just don't get the changes in those ecosystem states at that rate. But we would recommend perhaps every 5 years, something like that. Or if there is a major change, or if there is going to be a major change in the way the farm's managed, that sort of thing. So more periodic than that. So different elements at different time scales, but it's a good question. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
More questions in the accounts. Is this made accessible to farmers? Can they do the accounting themselves? Good question. We don't have the systems and processes at the moment that enables somebody to jump on to a web or an app and that sort of thing and fill in the fields that will generate the accounts. So at the moment, no. We hope that in the future we will be able to upgrade the systems and processes that will enable a farmer, perhaps with their farm advisor and maybe a natural capital accounting specialist, to be able to do this in tandem. But at the moment, Danny, you might want to jump in and comment on
Jim.
Well, it's not particularly.
So, Jim, what I was going to just say to that is the concepts. What we're trying to do as part of this project is just prove the value to the farmers by generating some accounts and working through with the farmers to see how valuable that information is and how to present it. The concepts that we'll be putting in a blueprint are things that anybody can pick up. So we're going to enable farm advisors, farm accountants, benchmarking organisations to be able to leverage the same methods that we're doing. So there's nothing stopping people from doing it. What Jim's talking about is the ability to standardise it in a tool set that anybody could pick up, and we're certainly working towards that, but we're still a ways away from that.
A question from Eva about coherence with ClimateWorks Natural Capital Measurement Catalogue. And are these operating at different scales? No, they're not. Either I've been involved very closely with, as has Danny and Sue from Integrated Futures, with the development of that Climate Works Natural Capital Management Catalogue, and it's entirely coherent with that. In fact, we've cross-checked our methods and seen how that they would fit into that catalogue.
Now, Jim, we've got one more question there, but I'm going to suggest that we move on, because Stephen, we'll cover that off a little bit in the next stages, where we talk about the relationship between the underlying ecological function and also the production systems.
Okay, no worries. Okay, I'll push on with the next next section. Goodness. Okay, so don't fret about the detail in that model that's jumped up on screen. All I want to say is that we have a range of what's called state and transition models. So this is an ecological framework by which we are assigning the state and condition of different ecosystems on a farm. So this one here is for grassy woodlands, and I'll show some pictures in a minute about what we might mean by the different things. But essentially, we have a reference condition woodland in the top left corner here, and that can be modified by a whole range of operations: clearing, grazing, addition of fertilizer, planting of trees, planting of crops, passive regeneration, these sorts of things. And so these transitions, these management actions that cause transitions in the condition state are represented by the arrows, and all the boxes here represent different condition states. So essentially, what's the attributes, what's the structure of the ecosystem? So we might have let me just put some pictures up here if I can get my thing. We might have a reference condition woodland that's got a full suite of, or close to a full suite of native species. It's got vertical habitat complexity with trees, shrubs, understory, whatever it might be, fairly undisturbed understory and ground layer. And then we will move through a range of what we're calling transitional woodlands, from a transitional woodland state 1 through to state 4, that are increasing in their level of disturbance, if you like, or increasing in their distance from this reference condition. There might be an increased proportion of exotic species in the ground layer. There might be reduced regeneration of different tree cohorts, so we don't have a full age cohort of trees. There might be reduced diversity of the understory species, and there might be reduced canopy cover. So we have a range of condition states for woodlands, for forests, for grasslands, but they still retain that essential or that basic structural component that makes it a woodland or a forest. Alternatively, we might have a condition state by which the overstory of trees is removed, and that woodland has been converted into what we call a derived grassland. And similarly, we have a range of derived grassland states that reflect the distance from, the distance, there we go. The distance from a good condition state. So, it's basically an increase in the proportion of exotic species in the understory, in the grassland component, as we move from a derived grassland state 1 through to a derived grassland state 5 and 6, which are entirely exotic species, mostly perennial in the case of state 5 and mostly annual in the case of state 6. But this is, again, just an increasing distance from this reference condition. In some cases, we might plant native trees back into the system, and so we've got a range of states that represent replanted areas. And then we might convert to a crop system with or without scattered trees, with and without irrigation, and so they're assigned their own condition state. And likewise, various exotic woody vegetation, horticulture, or exotic planted trees, shelter belts that are made of pines or other introduced species, or along creek lines, those sort of things are represented by different condition states. And likewise, we might get some shrublands growing back or being planted. So depending on what the original vegetation state in that biome was, we apply a different state and transition model. And this allows us to assign the ecological type and condition, ranging from, this reference condition through various stages of transition or disturbance, right the way through to, slightly modified production systems to highly modified production systems. And it enables us to put a label and a name and a condition, extent and state basically on every hectare on a farm. And so we assign all of the farm to one or more, or to one of these condition states. So when we're compiling the accounts, this is the overview of the steps that we go through. Firstly, we map the outline of the farm, and we define from remote sensing and from other spatial data sets such as state-based original vegetation mapping and those sorts of things. We assign our first cut, our first iteration, if you like, of those various ecosystem types. So we use tree canopy data from remote sensed layers or from aerial imagery. We combine that with ground cover data, again from remote sensed imagery, to identify areas that have similar characteristics in terms of their canopy cover and their ground cover and their original vegetation type, to give our first cut at these ecosystem types. From that, we then identify sites to go and visit on the farm. So we get a representative sample of sites that include all of the different, or most of the different ecosystem states that we think are occurring on this farm. And so we identify a range of sites to go and visit, roughly 20 to 30 per farm, but it'll vary depending on the size of the farm and the complexity of that farm in terms of the number of different states that it has. We then go and send our ecologists out onto the farm, and they visit these sites and collect a whole range of ecological data, related to the structure, the vegetation structure, and the land use of that paddock or that site. And this is really used as a verification step to say how well are we going at predicting the ecosystem state from space. We then bring that information back to the office, and we reconcile it with the original map and the original predictions, and we make a range of imputations, or we update it if needs be. If there's clearly discrepancies between what was seen on the ground and what we thought it was, we'll update that map and we'll make imputations to places that we didn't visit. And from that, we compile the asset register. So the ecological asset register. What are the ecosystem states that are present on a farm? And what's their total area? So we'll divide the farm up into these small areas. That's a combination of the paddock map from the farmer. I'll go through it because that's actually the next slide. The first thing that we get is the paddock maps from the farmers. So the outline of the farm and their paddocks. As I said, we use some machine learning to generate some ecological layers, the first ecological overlay that's based on canopy cover of the trees, and we do that by identifying areas that have high density tree cover, as you can see here, and these remnants here, compared to these sorts of patches here that might be sort of moderate density tree cover, and then there's some here that are very low density scattered trees, and then there's other areas that have got absolutely no tree cover at all. So that's our first ecological layer cut. We combine that with over here with our reference vegetation type, or our reference biome, and statistics of ground cover to identify areas that are similar in their canopy cover, their ground cover, and their original reference vegetation condition. And these are represented by the different colors in this map here. So areas that are of the same color are similar in that regard. So that's our first cut at the ecological overlay. And when I say ground cover, what I'm referring to is the percentage cover of live and dead material, or conversely, the amount of bare ground for the average for that paddock, for that ecosystem unit. And we're generally working here at paddock scale or sub-paddock scale. So you can see that there's the units here, these different coloured units in this map over here, roughly correspond to this paddock map here that we're provided with by the farmer. But in some cases, we will subdivide that paddock if there's, clearly differences in tree canopy or ground cover, or if the original biome was split down the paddock. So we're working at paddock or sub-paddock scale with this classification system. We will then go out and do the representative sampling sites, as I said, based on the type of canopy cover and ground cover disturbance patterns that we identified from space. And these little yellow dots represent for this farm the places that were visited. We've got a relatively rapid field assessment protocol that looks at ground cover, canopy cover, presence of shrubs, the amount of erosion, the composition of the ground layer, which we can't tell from space, and other elements like that. Takes about, depending on the site, sort of 20 minutes to half an hour per site. We then bring that back to the office and we reconcile the on-ground assessments with what we thought the condition was in the first instance, and then we'll impute the condition to other ecosystem units that have similar characteristics. So, for example, here we might have visited this site, and because this ecosystem unit over here is a similar canopy cover, similar ground cover characteristics, we'll assign this ecosystem state to this ecosystem unit here as well. And we'll do that in a semi-automated, but also a ground trekking manner, where we'll reconcile that with aerial imagery, sometimes get back to the farmer involved to check some things. But it's a sort of semi-automated, semi-manual process. Quite a time-consuming one at this point. And this is one of the steps that, as we progress, we want to try and increase the efficiency and the automation with which we do this. So from that stage, we then generate a table which basically assigns each of these ecosystem units the finest scale at our farm to a particular ecosystem state. And we have other information about that ecosystem unit, such as its area, its primary use. Is it primarily used for production purposes? And if so, is that grazing or cropping or horticulture or some other primary production use that we might encounter? Or is it primarily set aside for conservation purposes or for provision of ecosystem services? So it might be fenced and predominantly used for not used for production, although occasionally, in drought or every now and then, stock might be put into that particular ecosystem unit. So we assign a primary and a secondary purpose to each of those ecosystem units, as well as, the statistics around their area and their ecosystem condition and state. So that generates the ecosystem asset register, which is a big table of all of the ecological assets that are present on a farm. So we consider, an ecological asset to be those areas that have similar ecosystem condition and state, so all the same color in this map. And from that, we can assign various ecosystem services that flow from each of those ecosystem assets, and that's what generates the accounts. So in this project, we've done this for 50 farms. From right the way up here on the New England tablelands, through the central highlands of New South Wales, and then the southwest slopes, a bunch of farms 15 farms in north central Victoria, and 15 farms in the Midlands of Tasmania. So they're our pilot study farms, if you like, and farmers that we're using to stress test our methods. And those sorts of things. So again, I'll just pause there very quickly for questions before handing over to Danny, who'll actually take you through an example account of where we're at the moment. So you'll get to see the types of tables and the types of information that's included in the accounts themselves.
Jim, there are a couple of questions that came through on the chat. One of them was, what spatial tools do you use to ID the biome and canopy type? E.g., do we use state veg type maps? To a degree, we do that. So we're using NVIS to do the high level biome mapping. We are also using some of the state-based vegetation maps. The challenge with some of those is that they are quite coarse, so not working at the scale that we would like to work at. And so we have actually developed our own methods to just do things like canopy cover, where we're using, as Jim talked about, the machine learning to build those zones or the ecosystem units. But it's a matter of using a combination of those. It is one of the challenges that we've seen, getting information or getting data sets that are useful at the scale that we're working with on the farm versus the typical data sets that are available across a state or across the nation. They're working at a scale that's not necessarily appropriate for the farm scale natural capital accounts. Dee also piped in there with a comment about assuming that drones will help collect data more efficiently. Absolutely, the speed of tech that's coming through to help us automate some of this, the changes are rapid. And so, yes, using drones to quantify canopy cover and types of canopy, shrub layer, all those sorts of things, that sort of tech is certainly flowing through into these types of approaches, as are other methods for remote sensing and spatial analysis. We've got more and more information coming from satellite imagery and more fine-scaled imagery as well.
Yeah, I would just caution that about drones. Sometimes some of this new tech can be a false economy. So yep. I'm not. I mean, yes, we will try and incorporate it where where it proves to be efficient, but it's not necessarily quicker, better, cheaper, more effective just because there's some fancy tech assumed with it. How do you convert the information that comes from a drone to an ecosystem condition state? There's a lot of work that needs to be done there.
Yeah.
Yes, it is compatible with accounting for nature methods, in that accounting for nature is a framework by which methods are put forward, approved, and then used for particular projects. So, Michael, yes, we are planning to have our approach accredited under accounting for nature, but and we're entirely compatible with that. And we I think what AFN do is great work, but there is this misconception that there's an accounting for nature method, and there's not really. There's a whole range of methods that are approved and accredited by accounting for nature for use in particular projects. And so in that sense, yes, we are compatible, and we're hoping to have our methods approved down the track. What size farms have been tested? I found NSA to be challenging on smaller, highly modified southern farms. Our smallest farms are probably a couple of hundred hectares, Karen. So I don't really see a minimum size limit.
Yep.
If it's a full production, if it's a functioning farm, it might be a highly productive, intense intense production system of 100 hectares, 80 hectares. I'm pretty comfortable that we can apply it to small farms as well.
Yeah, the challenge can be scaling it up. So Jim talked about the sampling regime that we've got on a farm. We've got a couple of farms that were over 15,000 hectares, and getting a really good cost-effective representative sampling process across a very large farm is a challenge. And so that's where we do need to look at better methods for the prediction that Jim talked about up front, and then also speeding up the ecological assessments and the processing of those assessments.
Yeah, the costing's done, yes. So there's a question there from Kathy around whether any costing's done on what a grower could expect to have a natural capital account done on farm scale. Yes, I mean, at the moment, it's too expensive with using the process that we use for a farmer to burden the entire cost. So work we are doing is to bring the cost of generating two fronts, bring the cost of generating the account down through automation and different processes, and then put in place systems and Andrew will talk about this a bit more later, the pull through demand from the supply chain side of things, so that the cost is shared across the supply chain fairly. So the farmer doesn't have to carry the whole cost of generating the account. They might have some of it because they see value in it, but other parts of the supply chain are also contributing to the costs of doing the accounting. So we would expect and hope that at some point it becomes a natural, a cost of doing business as getting your financial accounts are, because there's going to be a need for it. So that we are working at that at several different angles, Kathy. But yes, at the moment, we recognise that the cost of doing the accounts is prohibitive, as is any new sort of tool, new tech as it comes on.
Now, Jim, there are a couple more questions, but I am just mindful of time.
Yeah, I'll try and answer them I'll try and answer them in the chat if you want to kick on, Danny. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
And I'll go on mute.
So if you can move to the next slide. Thanks, Jim. So I'm Danny O'Brien. I run a business called Integrated Futures, and we've been working on developing the methods for farm scale natural capital accounts and working with a range of farmers across a number of projects in building out these accounts, testing them with the farmers, and then just working through the best way to present the information to make it as useful as possible with farmers. Jim, if we go to the next one. So what we're generating for the Latrobe farm is an account for the farm showing their natural capital. But I just wanted to set the scene around what we mean by, or why we're doing these farm scale natural capital accounts. If you consider that your financial accounts tell you what you owe and what you own at a point in time. So you would normally redo your financial accounts every year, and your balance sheet will tell you, at this point in time, this is what I owe and this is what I own, and it'll show you compared to previous years. And then you've got your detailed transactions that tell you how you got from last year's point to this year's point. But what they don't tell you is whether that financial performance of the organisation has been achieved by potentially liquidating some of the underlying natural capital, or whether your performance has been impacted by activities that you've undertaken to change the nature of the natural capital that underpins your production systems. So some scenarios might be that you are maintaining the ecological condition and achieving a good financial output, or you might be consuming some of that natural capital. So over time, there is a change in that ecological condition, such that it might show that you're not farming from a long-term sustainability perspective. So the purpose of the natural capital accounts is purely just to provide an objective point-in-time assessment of what you have at that point in time. We expect that we would use these in conjunction with your financial accounts. They don't replace the financial accounts, but they're intended to be used in conjunction with them, just to provide a proof point at a point in time about what you have. You would then also have potentially a whole lot of narrative sitting around that, talking about the activities that were undertaken on the farm to change or manage that natural capital, and that along with your financial accounts ultimately gives you the picture of the management of the farm and what's happening there. So Jim, if we go to the next one. So I'm just going to take you through a few screenshots. But first of all, so a question was raised earlier about the time frames that we're doing things here. For the farm scale natural capital account project, we are just doing an initial point in time. So we're not able to do a multi-year assessment of the ecological condition. So we're just doing a point in time for that ecological condition. Our intention behind the design of accounts, just like your financial accounts showing you this year versus last year, we would anticipate that things like natural capital condition might be reassessed every 5 years, and including, as well as showing you effectively your balance sheet or your current state, it would show the changes from previous state to current state. What that would then allow you to do is understand how are my management actions impacting the natural capital on my farm? Am I having the desired output that I set my goals in terms of how I manage my natural capital? And are there some underlying changes that I hadn't anticipated? And now that might be due to changes in the climate, or it might be due to particular management activities that I've undertaken that might mean that certain elements of my natural capital have changed in a way that I didn't anticipate. So we're also including, Jim talked about the greenhouse gas emissions and resource use intensity. Neil, technically, I don't consider them necessarily part of a natural capital account in terms of what you owe and what you own, but they provide a lot of value to the farmers, we think, and so we think if we're collecting all of this production information, we might as well generate that sort of output. And as Jim mentioned, that sort of information, you would absolutely refresh it every year. So just when you're doing your financial accounts, you get all of your production information. We would anticipate that you would feed into that and update your emissions profile. You wouldn't necessarily just report on a single year. I think it's important to have a multi-year view of that, but we would anticipate that that might be updated on an annual basis. So Jim, to the next one. So Jim talked about the state and transition model, and the process that we go through to compile the accounts. So one of the things that we provide the farmers with is a detailed map, a digital map of their farm, their paddocks, some aerial imagery. I have had a couple of farmers come to me and say, oh, you did this really cool map, but can you put contours on it and things like that? So that sort of value we absolutely are providing back to the farmers. But then once we've done our compilation of all of the ecosystem assessments, we then provide a map back showing the different ecosystem types. So that map that you can see in the background is showing the different elements that we've mapped out for this farm. And then there's a key on the left there showing the different, the colour schemes and what those ecosystem types are. That's really just a visual representation of the table, which is just showing us our ecosystem type, the ecosystem state, and a description, and then how many hectares across the whole farm fit into that. One of the things that we'll have to look at is when we see a change from, let's say we do an assessment in another 5 years, how we present those changes so that we can see things that have maybe improved in condition and maybe things that have declined in condition. If we go to the next slide, one of the things we did as part of the Latrobe project is to do a categorical classification of grazing condition in each of the areas. Now, the farm that we're looking at there, it was predominantly a cropping farm with very little grazing, so there's a lot of grey there. But when we look at the livestock farms, we have this colour scheme across the whole farm. We are actively working at the moment to refine how we're calculating the grazing classification and working with organisations around Australia to leverage existing models. So the ABCD model that might be used in Queensland, things like LCAT, which is a landscape classification tool that's used in Queensland. And we're adapting those methods at the moment and refining our fieldwork assessments to then come up with a more standardised way of generating these classifications. And again, the intent behind this is to be able to provide a view of how my grazing condition has changed over time. Now, in terms of a question that we had earlier in the process around, is this something that farmers could do? I think this is absolutely something that we'd love to see farmers doing, being able to say, right, I'm going to go and reassess my grazing condition on each of my ecosystem units on an annual basis, or even more frequently than that, and then feed that in. So the accounts themselves would provide a point in time report. There are also a lot of tools out there today that are providing spatial analysis to provide feed on offer and things like that. So we're not trying to replace those tools, but it might be just a combination of those things that a farmer might leverage. So those are the two key graphical outputs that we're generating relating to the ecological assessment, or the rapid assessment that Jim talked about. We've also got a whole lot of information that Jim will talk about in relation to the ecosystem services that are delivered on the farm. So if we jump to the next slide, so we are, as we said, we are doing detailed calculations for greenhouse gas emissions. We're using the methodologies that are defined in Australia's greenhouse gas reporting national inventory. So we are taking the underlying production information, feeding it through that process and calculating emissions. We've taken a little step further to do things like differentiate between emissions that are coming from a geospheric source, i.e. fossil fuels and carbon that was sequestered millennia ago into the into the ground, and now we're emitting it back into the atmosphere as separate to what we're calling a biospheric source, whereby it is a much shorter cycle carbon cycle. So this is CO2 that's coming from the atmosphere into pastures, for example, into cows, and then coming out as methane. So there is still a global warming potential there that we have to consider, but we do look at that very differently to that longer cycle, because they have very different implications from a management perspective and from a climate perspective. We're also trying to provide, we're trying to not overwhelm, actually, just quickly back, Jim.
Sorry.
Yep. So just quickly, we're trying to provide as much detail as we can so that farmers can understand what levers they have available to them. So rather than just giving a big lump sum, we're trying to provide the level of detail across all of these different classes so that you can see where the major emissions are coming from and what levers you can pull. But the balance with all of that is try not to just provide so much data that it's incomprehensible. So we think we found the balance here. We provide some bar charts that sort of help display some of this, but happy to take feedback on whether we have gone too far there. So Jim, if we jump to the next one, the other thing that we're doing is we're leveraging on some work that was done by Kering, who's a large multi-billion dollar international clothing conglomerate. They generated a thing called the environmental profit and loss, where they were looking at their whole supply chain, at the different phases in their supply chain, and they were ultimately trying to come up with the physical quantification of the impact on the environment from a water pollution, air pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, land use change, waste per kilo of output from each of those steps in their production systems. They took it all the way through to providing a financial valuation of that. We don't have the capacity to do that. So what we've tried to do is stop at the physical quantification. But basically what it means is taking those emissions factors and then also looking at the breakdown or the relationship between the different products that are coming off a farm. So in this case, greasy wool. So we take those emissions, we allocate them to the various products coming off a farm, and then give you a rating to say, right, a 5-year average, in this case, so they're generating wool at 16.59 kilos of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of greasy wool. The reason that we're using a 5-year average rather than just using a point in time is some of these metrics can move quite dramatically depending on the timing of things, the timing of purchase and application of fertilizer, the timing of sale of livestock, or the timing of the clip of the wool and the sale of the wool. So by taking a 5-year average, we're just smoothing out some of those lumps and bumps so that any movement if we were to do a rolling 5-year average, any movement in those figures is smoothed out a little bit more so that any improvement in the metric is a genuine improvement rather than necessarily just a timing issue for some of the activities. We are also looking at water use from an absolute perspective, but then also looking at it from a stress-weighted perspective. So that's using some research that's just looking at relative water availability compared to everywhere else around the world, and just applying some factors there so that we might have a very high water use because we might irrigate, but we're in a very low water stress area and therefore it's fine. The flip side of that is we might have a moderate water use, but we're in a very high water stress area, in which case the stress-weighted water consumption goes up. We've also tried to model things like nitrogen use efficiency, lime use efficiency, and phosphorus use efficiency. And this is purely at what was applied, as opposed to doing what some of the existing agronomic models look at as the N taken off versus the N applied. So we're not looking at the amount of nitrogen taken off, for example, in the product. We're just looking at it in comparison to the total offtake of greasy wool in this case. Jim, if we jump to the next one, so we're doing that for wool, for live weight, sheep live weight, cattle live weight, cropping. We're also doing it for cropping. At the moment, we're just doing a lumping all of the crops together. The challenge that represents us is that it's very fickle to the yields that a particular crop might provide, and also in relation to the mix of crops that you might have on a farm. And so this one, to be honest, is still a bit of a work in progress in terms of the best way to provide this information back to farmers so that it's useful and valuable. And also, you can see the benchmarking column here is just all to be advised, and that's because there is no benchmark for a generic cropping regime across a farm. We're still working on the best way to be able to provide benchmark information so that farmers can look at a number and say, yes, how do I compare? And the reason that we're providing benchmarks references in any of this is just because it's one thing to provide a number through to a farmer. It's another thing for a farmer to turn to us and say, well, so what? What does that mean? And so we're trying to just pick up some of the industry benchmarks that are out there just so that farmers can see how they compare. So Jim, if we go on from there, the last thing, so we haven't got these in our current reports, but we will be updating the final reports for our farms. We are using a tool called Flint Pro to model the sequestration in the woody vegetation on a farm. So we're not just using the out-of-the-box Flint Pro model. We are considering where farmers have done specific plantings and taking all of that into account to model the sequestration in the woody vegetation above ground, plus all of root systems below ground, and then how that flows into dead organic matter. And in this case, you can even see that we've got some harvested wood that was taken it was harvested and then turned into wood product. So the intent here is just to provide the counter, right? So we're talking about emissions. This is then saying the woody vegetation on this farm is sequestering potentially, or this is an estimate of the sequestration for that vegetation. The key thing I would say here is that we're not using an emissions reduction fund methodology to do any of those calculations because they require a whole lot of field work and on-field assessments and things like that. So the estimate here for sequestration is not something that you could necessarily trade, especially because we're not following those methodologies. And we're also including things like remnant vegetation and the sequestration there, which is not considered additional from a CO2 trading perspective. But at least we're just trying to help farmers understand management of their landscape and improved management of their landscape should see an increase in the sequestration in the woody vegetation that might be used to offset their emissions from their farm. The other point I would make here is we would also like to consider soil carbon, but it's just such a contested space at the moment, and we didn't have the resources to be able to go and investigate soil carbon in detail, but we are looking to see whether we can provide some sort of mechanism as part of this project to estimate the movements in soil carbon as well. So I might pause for questions on that, and I can see that there were a whole lot of questions coming through from the so Jim and Ange, are there particular questions that came through from people relating to that piece?
Yeah, well, there's been a bunch. We've been doing our best to keep up with it. There's one from Steve here, though, about what happens when you don't apply nitrogen to pastures, but derive it from your pastures. How do you validate your modelling with that? So I presume that's in relation to emissions estimates.
So in terms of if we're not applying nitrogen to pastures, then from an emissions perspective, obviously we won't be generating any emissions from that nitrogen that is applied. There is in the greenhouse gas methodology, there is a consideration for the nitrification of the pasture residue, and so that does contribute to some of the emissions. In terms of validating our modelling, we're using we haven't gone to the step of coming up with our own models for nitrogen emissions or anything like that. So we are just using the standardised national inventory methodologies relating to NEN that was applied and how that should be considered, and then also the pasture residues. I think there is a broader question in the agronomic spaces around the nitrogen balance in your pastures, in terms of if you're exporting a whole lot of N but not putting any N in, then what is going to happen to your pastures long term? That wasn't a focal point for our project, and I'm probably not going to, I mean, that will open up a huge discussion. So our modelling is just looking at those inputs and then looking at the output from the farm, but we're not trying to get into that nitrogen balance per se in terms of nitrogen in versus nitrogen out.
Okay. And another question from Jasmine about farmers' access to the tool at the end of the project. What are the next steps for the tool, follow-on project or plans? Apologies if I missed this. Yes, I sort of didn't really miss it. Yes, as Danny said before, we'll be producing what we're calling a blueprint, a methods of how to do this, so that the ideas and the concepts behind it all will be available to anybody who wants to do it. Some of the processing and the operational stuff that I've gone through and that Danny's gone through, we won't have that as a tool, if you like, an app or anything like that people can pick up and run with themselves just yet. But absolutely, that's the aim eventually, and we have got we're hoping to have follow-on projects that enable us to develop those tools so that farmers can generate their own accounts with the help of their farm advisor. There was an earlier question too about training farm advisors, and we're doing a bit of that in the Farming for the Future project. But absolutely, that's a goal of the broader, well, not the goal of this project, but it's a goal hopefully of next steps and follow-on projects.
Yeah. So Jim, I might just jump in on top of the question that Stephen had around not applying N to pastures, but deriving it from pastures. And then the follow-up question that Phyllis had around nitrogen rundown in Brigalow. I guess from an accounting perspective, what I would expect to see is if you are seeing a rundown of the nitrogen in pastures such that they're not as productive, and therefore you're not getting your production outputs that you would expect, I would expect to see that appear in the accounts in a couple of ways. One of them is you would see a change in the pasture composition, and then potentially a reduction in the pasture condition for that pasture. So you would see that, and now that's going to take a little while to affect. I think you would also expect to see that looking in your financial accounts, you would expect to see potentially a reduced productivity. If you are not having as viable pastures, you would probably not be able to run as many animals, and therefore you'd see an impact from a production perspective there.
Thanks. There's a question around staying engaged with the project. I'm just going to put my email in the chat, and if you email me, I'll add you to our e-newsletter, which is probably the best way to stay engaged with updates. Okay.
Now, I'm just mindful of time, Jim, so we might move on to yours. Yep.
Okay. So we want to include estimates around the value of natural capital for biodiversity, some of those broader public benefits that we're talking about, as well as various ecosystem services that might be considered as an aid to production, but also in a broader sense, some public benefit services. So our questions are, what's the relationship between natural capital and some elements of biodiversity? We look closely at birds and plants, a couple of what I call fauna-mediated ecosystem services, generally driven by invertebrates, but some birds contribute as well to pollination, pest control, decomposition, and alternative some plant-mediated ecosystem services, essentially shade and shelter on the farm. And it's been mentioned soil crust and things like that, and also soil condition is an aspect that we're looking at as well. I won't cover that though today. Results are still working on those. Just to give you a bit of a sneak peek on some of the results that are coming out of the project, we had the luxury in our farm scale natural capital accounting project to be able to have quite an extensive ecological research program running alongside the natural capitals compilation, which is what we've been talking about today. And this has enabled us to generate some estimates and models of some of these functions and values. So if we're looking firstly just at the biodiversity program, as an example of this farm, we went out and we did detailed plant surveys and detailed bird surveys at selected sites across the farm that represented those different ecosystem states, if you like. It was in proportion to those ecosystem states that were on the farm. So cropping and riparian zones, shelter belts, remnant vegetation, remnant grasslands, and that sort of thing. And as I said, we measured plants, we measured birds, we did some invertebrate work at selected sites. And so from that, we've developed models or predictions of the diversity of all birds, in this case here on the left-hand map, and woodland birds, so a pre-identified cohort of woodland birds, which we know to be of conservation concern. As a function, so we developed these predictions of their species richness at the site scale, at the scale of a 1 hectare component within each of these different land uses or each of these different ecosystem states on a farm. And we used variables such as, what is the ecosystem state, the ecosystem type, how much wooded vegetation is there in the surrounding area, what's the patch size of that wooded area or of that grassland, and some local topographical features such as the height above rivers, the elevational variation of the site. To generate these models of bird diversity. So you can see here, this is one of the farms that we looked at before. As Danny said, it's mostly cropping country, mostly cropped and or some olive groves up here. So it has a relatively low bird diversity score, but you can see along the river here, along the Loddon River, we've got some higher levels of both overall bird diversity and also woodland bird diversity. And there's a sanctuary or a remnant woodland down here in the bottom southwest corner that has much higher value as well. So then we can, if for the accounting side of things, we can calculate the area on that farm that provides varying quality habitat for all birds and for woodland birds. And we can see in this case, there's quite a low proportion of the overall farm that falls into the good or very good, that didn't really work, good or very good category, only 5.7% of the farm overall. Although this is a large farm, so that's still 290 hectares of good or very good quality habitat for woodland birds, which, as I mentioned, are a group of conservation concern. Here's a different farm with a very different composition, and we can see a very different result. This one, it's the same scale for all birds and for woodland birds as we saw in the last farm. So you can see a lot more darker colours representing higher bird diversity predicted at that 1 hectare scale, and more better quality habitat for all birds and for woodland birds. So this one has 2,800 hectares of good to outstanding quality woodland bird habitat down here. My square sort of fell off sync there, but over 2,800 hectares, which accounts for most of the farm, about 84% of the total farm area. So it gives, in terms of an accounting sense, it gives an idea of how much of your farm is providing this service, biodiversity service for woodland birds in this case. We'll also generate estimates of the total bird species richness and woodland bird species richness for the farm as a whole. So these maps show the predicted richness, per hectare, so up to 22 sort of birds, but the number of birds in the farm as a whole, we know, is much greater than that. For this farm, it's somewhere around 80 or 90 species that we detected in total, because when we look at the turnover or the variation between different sites, we accumulate more and more species. So to look at that overall whole of farm measure, based on factors like the overall amount of tree cover, the proportion of different ecosystem states on the farm, the diversity or heterogeneity of those ecosystem states, and the amount of replanted vegetation we found to be important. So we'll also generate similar maps and tables for native plants, as well as for different types of plant groups, different guilds. So, perennial grasses or native herbs and these sorts of things. So they'll be forthcoming, hopefully in time for the final accounts by the end of the year. In terms of, I think I've gone one too quick, I have. In terms of some of the ecosystem services provided by insects, we did some transects and looked at the diversity and abundance of different insect groups as a function of the production type in the paddock. Was it a crop? Was it a high diversity, plant diversity pasture, or a lower, more simple plant diversity pasture? Factors such as distance from the edge of the paddock, whether the adjacent vegetation was remnant revegetation or a grassy non-woody vegetation type, and again some topographic features like local elevation variation and height above rivers and things like that. And from those we generate again heat maps or estimates of the in this case the abundance and diversity of decomposers, beetles and millipedes and copepods and things like that in the litter layer in this case. And we can see here, this is the non-production areas in this darker green, and this is an estimated abundance measure of these decomposers across the paddocks that are various distances, and it will from the remnant vegetation areas, and it will also be influenced by what's happening in those paddocks as well. And we'll generate similar values again as we saw with the birds of areas of high, moderate, low or no decomposer value across the farm. And we'll generate similar heat maps for pollinators and for invertebrate predators and parasitoids, those beneficials, in a prey control sense. We're also experimenting with some metrics to quantify and spatially explicitly predict the benefits provided for shade and shelter. So shade and wind shelter, wind protection. And this is an example of the shade value for that same farm that I showed with that had the high woodland bird diversity before. So in effect, it's based on a map of the canopy cover. But what we're doing is we're estimating what's the shade value, what's the shade index, how much of the farm is having a shaded benefit or being shaded at 3 o'clock in the middle of summer. So on the summer solstice in the middle of the afternoon when you would want maximum shade value, what's the length of the shadow cast by the trees on your property? And to do this, we calculate it as a function of the sun angle and the height of the trees, and we partition that by whether it's either cropping or grazing land. So this might look here at this large scale just like a map of the trees, but if we zoom into this area here, we can sort of see that no, in actual fact, what we're doing is we're actually modeling where the shade is cast and how much of that is on the property and what is the production value or its production use of where that shade is being cast, and is there a value of that? Is there a service being provided? So clearly, if it's a livestock property, there is a value to it. If it's a cropping property, perhaps less so. And so this is another example, again, for the other farm that we were showing before, and clearly much less shade being cast on this property. And we'll generate this for both for shade, but also for shelter, for wind protection, using similar principles of tree height or shelter belt height, and predominant wind direction in winter to provide protection from cold winter winds, mostly for livestock benefit, livestock protection, and in summer from hot summer winds, mostly for soil moisture conservation for crop production purposes. So some estimates of some shade and shelter ecosystem services that are spatially explicit and can be summed up to give a measure for the whole of the farm. The statistics showed there before. So these are some of the sorts of services that we're trying to contribute. I'll run through this. I won't go through this because we're running out of time. But from our ecosystem asset register and translation that into spatial maps, we should be able to provide some estimates, some unit of measure for some of these. And finally, as part of the natural values, we are producing a natural capital indices dashboard, which has at the moment 6 or 7 whole of farm metrics that cover things like what's the overall condition of your forage condition on your farm for a livestock grazing farm, what's an overall measure of your soil condition, essentially based on ground cover at the moment. There was a question in the chat about biocrusts and those sorts of things. For the farms we're working in, ground cover is the best surrogate that we have at the moment for soil condition. Measures around the arrangement of native vegetation on the farm that influence things like connectivity and proximity of production areas to wooded vegetation, and some metrics around the overall ecological condition of the farm, the overall distance from that reference condition, and how well are your aquatic systems, particularly your riparian areas, being managed. So that will be provided as a dashboard, high-level dashboard for each of the farms. And we are also producing a digital platform to try and bring this together so that the farmer has access to a lot of the information that Danny presented and the layers that I was just showing there around the biodiversity and ecosystem services will enable them to drill down into particular elements of it, to turn layers on and off, to use particular parts of it to generate reports that they can use share with their stakeholders, whoever they may want to, and have a digital on the run platform for accessing and utilizing a lot of this information. We want to get it to a situation where they can, input their observations and some of their on-farm monitoring tech into the digital platform as well to update these things as we go. But we won't be there as part of this project, but that's again the vision for the digital platform going forward. So I might just skip over this question section and hand over to Ange. And if people have questions, there might be some in the chat that I'll answer as Ange is talking, or we can chat about it at the end. So Ange, over to you.
Thanks, Jim. So my name's Angela Horton. I work for Bush Heritage Australia, and we've provided the data collection services on farm for most of the natural capital accounts. Jim's team went further with the natural values assessment work that was part of the research side, but we've collected the data for the farm assessment for the natural capital account. And we've also supported work into the sort of sector engagement part, where we've worked with stakeholders of farming sector more broadly. And so I think that's important because we see benefits of these natural capital accounts well beyond just the farmer. And I think as I go through these slides, I'll explain that. But really what we want the whole project has been designed around how can these accounts benefit the farmer. So I'm going to quickly go through 4 slides that talk to that, and then some of the things that have already been discussed around next steps and what we hope to do with the program going forward. So firstly, supporting farm decision making. The natural capital accounts create the relationship between natural capital and farm production. So information in the accounts can assist farmers to see where on their farm they can make improvements to make more sustainable, to become more sustainable by improving that natural capital condition. But also to take effect and advantage of free gifts that nature can provide to improve the actual business and production and profitability of the property. So we have already seen some examples where farmers might use the accounts to better identify where to plant those trees to maximise. Can we have the examples, please, Jim? Thanks. To show, using the maps that Danny showed before, we might be able to identify where it would be best to plant new trees, new plantings, to have maximum effect of the production outcomes for shade and shelter. Similarly, we've got the forage condition maps, which, as we've said, if we're able to update them regularly, farmers can optimise the placement of their stock, knowing that the forage condition in that particular paddock is more beneficial at a particular time of the year. So I think what we're finding is that what you don't measure, you can't manage. And we're providing information to farmers that they haven't had before, which is allowing them to make decisions, more nuanced decisions about management and changes that they might make on their farm to benefit both production outcomes, but also to increase their sort of environmental health and sustainability. We do have a sister project that we've been working with called Farming for the Future, and that is taking a much more in-depth look at the relationship between natural capital and production. And they will be releasing their initial results from 130 farms, which includes a number of the Latrobe farms that we've accessed here, next week. So please stay tuned to press releases and things related to that project, because that uses the same types of methodologies we've developed here and takes it further into that relationship between natural capital and farm productive benefit. Next slide, please. We also see that there's benefits for the farmers in terms of how they interact with the supply chain. this audience will be well aware of the external drivers on supply chains, from consumers and investors to firstly disclose and then to reduce their reliance on greenhouse gas emissions, for instance, but also on nature. And to do that, they need farm scale information. So the natural capital accounts can provide that farm scale data in a format that allows the company to aggregate with other producers and with their manufacturing processes to give them that data at an overview of the whole product in terms of its sustainability, its use of greenhouse gases, its use of nature, its risk going forward. That's all sort of part of that program that's being looked at in terms of the Task Force on Nature-related Disclosures. So they can also use this information for those reporting purposes, but also to market their products. And we're seeing that already, but we don't want that to be greenwashing. So with the natural capital accounts, that's not that they'll actually have the farm level data to rely on to produce those broader accounts. We also know that farm businesses themselves are marketing themselves directly, and the natural capital accounts can provide that data to substantiate any of their marketing claims. We can also, the accounts can also be used for reporting requirements under certification schemes, such as greenhouse gas emissions and disclosures that are coming down the pipeline, certification schemes and other market access disclosures. We have this view that we'd like farmers to collect this information once and then share it many times and create a vehicle around the accounts that allows them to do that to whichever stakeholders they choose to share the information. We're keen to make that as easy through integrating technologies to be able to do that. We've already had experience with farmers through use of very early natural capital accounts who have received, long-term contracts with buyers and premium pricing just on the basis that they are monitoring this information, not even secondary accounts that show change over time at that point. So they do have benefits to the farmers directly in terms of those relationships with supply chains. And through the project, we also engaged with a number of buyers that we referred to as the Natural Capital Buyers Club, and found extraordinary interest in the accounts, how we went about developing them, what they're going to look like, and how they might use them in their own businesses for both that sort of marketing purposes, but also reporting up and including in their lifestyle assessment type information. So I think there's a big opportunity there going forward, and we hope to keep working with those buyers, that buyers club, as we roll the accounts out, work with the farmers, make those learnings and share that knowledge. Ditto pretty much for everything I said on the last slide for the finance sector, except possibly more so. So the finance sector, probably more than anyone, is under scrutiny for its climate and its natural capital risk and reporting, and they need the farm data as well. So the accounts can communicate that farm environmental performance alongside its financial performance, and that can be shared with insurers and bankers and other investors. And the accounts provide that evidence of sustainable production, resilience against climate, nature, maintenance or positive outcomes. And over time, farms that can show that over time through the accounts will be viewed by investors as attractive investments. So again, we've got a couple of the farms that have been in our group or in preceding projects that have already received discounted loans from banks based on their early accounts. And we're already aware that the banks are looking at how they can develop green lending products to farmers that can evidence lower risk of climate-related issues and nature. And it's the outcome measures like the natural capital account data that can provide that evidence. And again, our sister project, Farming for the Future, has partnered with the Australian Sustainable Finance Initiative. And basically that means the banks, the Australian banks, to work through how the finance sector can be using this information for their reporting purposes. But what that project is very keen to do, and us alongside them, is work out how the whole sector can support the collection of this information through a finance mechanism that means that the burden for producing the accounts isn't solely put onto the farmer. Clearly, the banks and the supply chains are getting benefit, and so the data collection should share that burden. And finally, support for ecosystem service markets. So these are nascent markets. They're not, there are some that are well underway, but others that we're not quite sure how they're going to pan out yet, particularly the Commonwealth Nature Positive certificates. But as we've talked about already today, that the methods that we're using are consistent with the SEER. They're consistent with the AFN method, which is also consistent with the SEER, System of Environmental Economic Accounts. It's consistent with Climate Works catalogue. We know we've got a robust approach here, so we believe that it will be applicable in terms of providing evidence. Maybe it needs to be in a different format, we don't know yet, but it's likely to be able to be used in terms of other processes, other systems that are yet to be developed in terms of biodiversity markets, and it's already being used in terms of accounting for nature. Methods are already being used to support price premiums for carbon projects under the Queensland Government's Land Restoration Scheme, and we are intending to have our method accredited at a high level for our farms, given the specificity of the information that we're collecting and the scale at which we're collecting it. We think it will reach the bar of a high level AFN method. Also, just to note that the farm scale, the approach we've taken in the methods was actually derived from a stewardship program for parts of a farm, and now we've scaled it up. So those methods are very strong and robust and accepted by the market. In terms of next steps, we've got big ambitions, and it won't be just the La Trobe group. There's a much broader group that we need to work with to continue to expand the methods to include more farm enterprises. We've mainly done livestock in this approach, but we do want to include more cropping properties. We want to include horticulture, agroforestry, rangelands that have been mentioned. We do need to work out ways to reduce the data collection costs, reduce the analysis time and cost, and that's through automation that Jim's already referenced. We're very keen to work and develop an alliance of natural capital account producers, and we know there's Land to Market and other organisations out there that are doing great work in a similar vein, but work towards standard measures and getting those accredited. We're really keen that we have a system that's supporting farmers that aren't competing on methods, because that doesn't make any sense. We want them to be, those service providers to be competing on services. And we need to do that. We need to think pre-competitively about how we can standardise the measures and have them used broadly. So we want to continue to work with industry stakeholders at a broad range. So that's supply chain, that's finance sector, it's the people who are advising the agricultural sector, to work with them about how to generate the accounts, how to read the accounts and get the best knowledge from them, how to integrate the accounts with other technologies so that we can do that collect once and share many times. We want to develop case studies around how the farmers are using the information, and we need to work on how we can fund the repeat generation of these accounts through time, because that's really where the rubber will hit the road in showing the benefits that farmers can generate on their properties and becoming more nature positive. That's me. Jim, back to you.
Thanks, Ange. Thanks, Danny. Thanks, everybody. So we're at our 1.5 hours. In fact, we're 4 minutes over. So apologies for holding you from your lunch if that's what you're doing. But I'd just like to acknowledge that this has been a massive project. I've left people off this slide, but all of these people have been involved to some level. We've also had a number of volunteers helping us out in the field. But clearly our 50 farmers that we've been working with, I'd like to acknowledge that we wouldn't be able to do it without them, without access to their properties and access to their data and things like that. So it's been, they're obviously a key partner in this. I'm happy to stick around longer to answer any questions that people may have. But thank you very much for your interest and your attention. And happy to just stick around and answer questions that people may have, or at least try to.
Jim, I was going to say we do have that initial draft account sitting up on the website. So maybe we can get a link out for that, so that if people are interested in actually looking at how we've sort of put all of the initial accounts together, and when we publish a final account for the farms, that'll also be available up on the Latrobe website as well.
Yep. I might send that link through to Ange, and
Yep.
she can maybe put it in with when
Yep.
it's the recording available.
Yep.
If anybody's got any questions, happy to just come off mute and ask them.